I almost got off with the world's briefest presentation. And I thank Bob for that. I got into physics a long time ago. As a young kid, I really was curious about the world, and I thought that science would be the way to get the answers. So I went to MIT and Princeton thinking that conventional physics was going to have a satisfying theory of the universe, and I kind of came away feeling that something was missing still. It didn't seem as though the basic deep questions all fit together very well. This is a book that sort of summarizes my search to date, The Synchronized Universe, New Science of the Paranormal. What I found in the mid-'80s is a clue for what I was missing. Can everyone hear me in the back okay? Is this okay? I discovered remote viewing. And remote viewing, of course, allows you to move in space and in time far beyond what our conventional physics would allow based on causality. So that was just, plus it doesn't weaken with distance, with the square of the distance like the forces we know about do. So all of a sudden we had some major anomalies, and I realized this was a clue for me that maybe there were some things that the grad school had not covered that I needed to look into. Since that time, a number of other anomalies have shown up in mainstream physics. Of course, physicists, theorists are very quick to provide explanations for them, dark matter being one, but it was kind of an unexpected anomaly. When I went to grad school in the gravity group at Princeton, no one talked about dark matter. Everyone thought that the Big Bang model was in pretty good shape in those days. Now we know there's a whole lot of extra stuff out there that was not included. We're also seeing anomalies in pendulum phenomena. This is the Maurice Allais experiments. Erwin Saxel and others have also duplicated this. When you have a pendulum swinging and the Earth turns beneath it, there's a certain angular change the pendulum is supposed to undergo. But when a solar eclipse occurs, an anomaly happens. The angle veers off in many cases at a strange angle, suggesting that something is missing from our current gravity model. Cold fusion, despite all the hoopla after the -- announcements and the supposed failure to replicate at MIT and Princeton, we now know that MIT and Caltech, we now know that the MIT group actually did get excess energy, which they subtracted out in the final draft of their paper. And since then, over 500 labs around the world have replicated various aspects of cold fusion. We don't really have a theory, a satisfactory theory, for why it happens, but there are a number of very successful experiments going on today in many labs around the world. Charge clusters, one more anomaly that falls into current hard science. If you create a spark in a vacuum chamber and you produce a large number of electrons in a very small space, if you make maybe 10 billion or so in a micron size sphere, anomalies start to show up that are not accounted for by current physics. They don't repel at enormous speeds the way they should. Instead, they tend to clump together. So when they hit a witness plate some distance away, the lower picture there shows the pattern that you get. Each dark spot is a charge cluster with billions of electrons, and these charge clusters themselves develop little magnetic fields, and they kind of link together like pop beads on a necklace when they hit the witness plate. We think probably that at this density of charge, we're getting some zero-point vacuum anomalies that are not currently explained in current physics. But it certainly is one more clue that our science does not have all the answers at the present time. When this charge cluster hits a metal plate, you get a hole. It drills into the plate in the top picture here, and it looks a lot like some kind of fusion or some kind of very strong melting is occurring when the electrons hit the metal. In cosmology, there are also anomalies. This is a Halton Arp photograph of a fairly nearby a galaxy with jets that are connected to three objects that are classified as quasars that should be much, much further away than the nearby object, and yet they have these jets connecting them. And he reasons from this that actually our whole idea of what a quasar is wrong, and that our whole idea of redshifts are missing something important. The speed of light, one more example, Raymond Chow and others, we've seen anomalies in the speed of light where we get faster than light propagation in some cases. What I want to talk about today are other types of phenomena that also give us hints about anomalies that might help us to construct a better theory of physics or help us to guide us if we are missing things that need to be added. And of course, the paranormal phenomena and UFOs are two anomalistic areas that are good guides to provide clues for us. So we can look at what some of those experiments and incidents teach us. I'm not trying to prove that either one exists today. That's a big subject that would be a much longer talk. Some good references supporting each phenomena can be suggested. For the paranormal, the Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain by Ostrander and Schroeder back in 1970 was one of the great watershed books. Margins of Reality by Bob John and Brenda Dunn, Dean Radin's books, Bill Tiller's books, Joe McMonagle's books, and I'll put mine at the bottom there. I think I try to summarize these things, but there are many, many books that provide a good guide for those who are learning about the anomalies in the paranormal. And for UFOs, I would say Timothy Good's Above Top Secret was one of those great books in the late 80s that showed us there was some substance here that we had not been seeing before. Michael Heseman's UFOs, The Secret History is a very thorough book about some of the evidence. Phil Corso's Day After Roswell, Ray Fowler's books, John Mack's books, and Whitley Strieber's books all give different views of this very complex and large subject. Some paranormal phenomena, as you know, have been demonstrated in the lab with good statistics. The Princeton Pear Lab, Dean Radin's Global Consciousness Project, ESP, PK, and remote viewing, now we can say have been established with high probability in my mind. Some effects are more spectacular and rare and more controversial, and they depend more on anecdotal evidence, levitation, teleportation, etc. This is a problem studying UFOs scientifically, since you can't really control repeatability. Although it's desirable to have good statistics, in science, some events are rare and non-repeatable, and yet we have to live with it if the event is spectacular enough. The Big Bang is one we're kind of stuck with. We get one to study. The first atomic bomb test was sufficient to convince the military that they were ready to go. The omega minus particles sort of scotched to convince people that SU-3, the eightfold way of Mary-Gell-Mann, was correct. So there are cases where a few examples have a lot of power. It's not ideal, but we're stuck with, basically, until we have some better data. In case of UFOs, there are some really high credibility witnesses. So for people who have not looked into this subject or who are skeptics, it's worthwhile looking at what some pretty high credibility individuals have said about their existence. It's time for the truth to be brought out. Behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about UFOs. But through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe the unknown objects are nonsense. And this is the former CIA director, Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, in a statement to Congress. This flying saucer situation is not at all imaginary or seeing too much in some natural phenomena. Something is really flying around. The phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious. General Nathan Twining, Chief of Staff, U.S. Air Force. More than 10,000 sightings have been reported, the majority of which cannot be accounted for by any scientific explanation. I am convinced that these objects do exist and that they are not manufactured by any nation on Earth. I can therefore see no alternative to accepting the theory that they come. No, I have a 30-minute talk. I may be late, but I'm not that late. Okay. I can therefore see no alternative. Bob's just trying to keep me from talking today. I don't know what's going on. I can therefore see no alternative to accepting the theory they come from some extraterrestrial source. And that's Air Chief Marshal Lord Dowding, Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Air Force Fighter Command, World War II, quoted in the Sunday Dispatch. And the last quote I'll offer today, we're ordered to hide, this is the quote, we're ordered to hide sightings when possible. But if a strong report does get out, we have to publish a fast explanation, make up something to kill the report in a hurry, and also ridicule the witness, especially if we can't figure a plausible answer. We even have to discredit our own pilots. And that's from Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, Chief of the Aerial Phenomena Branch, Air Technical Intelligence Service, former head of Project Blue Book. So if you wonder why there are not many good reports, these are some clues. So what I want to talk about today are some similar phenomena that are seen in both UFO cases and in parapsychology cases. If true, they can offer valuable guides in extending current physics. So what's the nature of the evidence? We have a variety of different types of phenomena. Remote viewing was one that got me involved. I took 3 courses in remote viewing, had a number of my own dramatic experiences. I'm not going to go over them here. My book talks about my own experiences, but it's enough to convince you that something real is going on that you can't explain. Of course, the military created a program in the early 70s through the CIA sponsorship that went on for more than 20 years with very expert people, carefully selected as remote viewers, and very high accuracy. As the Princeton Pear Lab has shown, you can take average people or fairly average people. If you do enough experiments, you can still get good data. They're not as good as some of these star remote viewers like Pat Price or Joe McMoneagle, but if you do enough statistics, you still get positive results. So we all have this ability to some degree. What's remarkable is it does not weaken with distance or with time offset very much, not the way that you would expect if it were one of the familiar laws of physics. And Jessica Utz did a statistical analysis of some of the remote viewing tests and concluded that it's a real effect. Both Joe McMoneagle and Ingo Swann have remote viewed structured craft, and in fact in the military program that was one of the interesting things that went on, that they often were given UFOs as remote viewing targets. And this is just a quote from one remote viewer looking into a UFO. I'm not going to go into this. I think we're probably a little short on time here. But oftentimes when you do remote viewing of UFOs, people get information about the drives, the engines, the propulsion, the occupants, things like that. So there has been a lot of interplay and exchange of information back and forth using remote viewing as a tool to look at UFOs. And also, people who have abduction experiences who are taken aboard craft often are taught psychic practices that help them to become better remote viewers. So there's a back and forth in this whole subject. The out-of-body experience is one more familiar phenomena. At the present time, that the Chinese and U.S. have reproduced with hard experiments in the laboratory the reality of the OBE. It's not just something where you think you went out of body and you're kind of fooling yourself. They've been able to measure physical, measurable electromagnetic distortions that happen when someone goes out of body. And in the Chinese case, they put their target. It was a Chinese character written on a piece of paper in an envelope in a sealed room next to a piece of X-ray film. And they found that when their Chinese remote viewer, and some of these guys are really, really good, when they were able to read that character correctly, and the odds, you have 50,000 characters, so getting the correct one by chance is very difficult. When they got the right character, they found that the film was exposed. and it was imprinted with a shadow of the Chinese character that was next to it. So some kind of energy form was present at the envelope when the remote viewer was there. Some American experimenters have repeated the experiment using photomultiplier tubes and gotten similar results, not quite as strong statistically, but similar results. Back in the 70s, Carlos OSIS and Alex TANOUS conducted an OBE experiment where the target was in a sealed room surrounded by various detectors. And when when TANOUS was getting correct information about the remote viewing target, the detectors were going crazy. They were showing electromagnetic fields, strain gauge sensors, other things that correlated with his accurate viewing. And Keith Harari did a much cheaper version of this experiment. He had a pet kitten that liked him a lot. He had quite a bond. And they put the cat in a box out in the middle of a field, and they observed what the cat was doing. And they noticed that when the cat was nervous, it would pace the box. So they had squares marked in the bottom of the box, and the cat would meow. So they counted the meows, and they counted how many squares it crossed. Then Harari was off, half mile away or something in another building. He would go OBE and attempt to come and comfort the kitten. And the right-hand graph is the meows per minute. On the left-hand column, when he's not trying to comfort the kitten. And the right-hand column, which is virtually invisible, the meows per minute when he's comforting the kitten. The cat got quiet. The cat knew he was there. And the same results showed up with how many squares the kitten was crossing. So this is a low-tech way to repeat that experiment. A variety of people have mastered OBE travel, and of course Bob Monroe at the Monroe Institute has technology for helping people to do this. We know a lot about this process now. And of course, it defies our current science. We can't really explain in electromagnetic terms what the astral body is or how you can have a consciousness outside a physical body. But Bob Monroe did experiments in that state, and one thing he found is that when he was in a room that had a wire mesh in the walls, and he charged that wire mesh up to a high voltage, he was unable then to escape from the walls of the box. So there's an interaction between high voltage and the astral body. OBEs, of course, are also seen in UFO cases. This is a drawing by Betty Andreasen Luca, who had many encounters, and this is one of her abductions. She's sketching two pictures of herself, one her physical body lying on the sofa, the other her OBE body, which is being led by a little being up into the craft. So a lot of activities are reported in abduction cases where the physical body is remaining behind and the person is going up to the craft in the astral form. So it plays a big role in whatever is being taught to the abductee. The soul and the whole dynamics of the soul, the path of the soul, plays a big role in parapsychology. In the near-death experience, this is Daniel Brinkley's near-death experience. He reported going through a panoramic life review, having these 13 beings of light interrogate him and show him various images of the future. This is, as Raymond Moody studied the near-death experience phenomena and found the same pattern occurs over and over again in people of very different cultural and religious backgrounds. Orbs are often seen leaving the body at death. I've talked to nurses in hospitals who are with people doing hospice work, and oftentimes a form of orb is seen leaving the body. And I move quickly here. So there is this energy form that our present science can't really explain, that is often associated with consciousness and seems to be able to leave the physical body. In the UFO area, when abductees are taken aboard craft, this is another Betty Andreasen Luca drawing, but it correlates with other people's descriptions, that in that light body, that astral form, they often go through exercises and lessons, which they don't make a lot of sense to us, but it appears as though they're being taught something about the nature of that form of consciousness. And this is a depiction of a case that Stephen Greer talks about, where a friend of his had just learned to go out of body and was zipping up through the atmosphere, and as he did, he collided with something. And this was all in what he would say would be the astral dimension, but he encountered a craft there, and the occupants were just as startled with him as he was with them. And the conclusion that Greer comes to from this is that ETs that sometimes engineer things in the astral dimension. So if you credit these accounts, there's a technology there and a lot we can learn about these other dimensions from looking at these cases. PK, of course, the Princeton Paralab has done a lot of wonderful experiments with PK. And this is Ingo Swann's famous experiment where he was able to influence a magnetometer that was heavily shielded, that no one has ever been able to influence it before under any conditions, and he could pretty much cause it to go off scale at will. So the mind is able to affect these things. This is Rene Pioch's little baby chick experiment where he instrumented a robot with a random event generator. And as we know from the other experiments, our mind is able to affect a random event generator. He used that as the steering mechanism and then had it bond with the baby chicks. So they thought it was their mother. So the top graph shows the path of the robot before any bonding has occurred. It's a view down into the pin where the robot is moving around, making the random walk. The pin where the baby chicks are going to be put is on the right-hand side. In the lower figure, the only difference is the chicks have been bonded with the robot and have been placed in the cage. So apparently they're able to influence the random event generator that's steering the robot to cause it to hover, which just shows that we aren't the only ones who can do this. A lot of PK experiments are reported in contactee and abductee cases. I'm going to move quickly along here, but ESP is, of course, one more area where we see evidence both from parapsychology research as well as from abductee and contactee cases that some kind of psychic communication goes on between the ETs and the humans. One of the fascinating things to me is that we all seem to have this ability, even though most of us are not aware of it. This is an experiment by Lloyd back in the 70s, looking at how the brain waves respond. The top trace shows when a tone is played and the brain wave reacts with a certain pattern. The lower trace shows how the brain responds when someone sends the subject an ESP message. And even though the person was unaware that an ESP message had been sent to him, his brain waves showed a pattern that was almost identical to the top one. At the subconscious level, he knew that he had received a message. Unfortunately, most of us have so much chatter in our conscious mind that we're not really linked up, in touch with those messages. But that's where meditation and hypnosis help a lot in allowing people to get more access. This is just Bob John's statement that these forces are anomalous. They don't weaken with distance. They operate across time, and that tells us that something is needed, something is missing from our current science. I think I'm probably running a little bit late here. How are we doing on time, Bob? How much? 7 minutes, okay. Orbs are one more area that are kind of implied by the OBE experiments. Today, people love to talk about orbs and show orb photographs. Of course, as we know, many of those are probably artifacts. It's easy to get lens flare, it's easy to get bugs, it's easy to get dust in the near field of the camera that looks like an orb. So you can't always be sure that it's an orb. Stereophotography or a few other ways really help a lot in removing all those anomalies. However, this is one picture that it shows, in my mind, a real orb. It's a daylight photograph taken by a friend of mine about 4 in the afternoon. You may not be able to see it from here, but it's about a 3-foot diameter orb hovering in front of a cabin in the woods. And you can actually see the post the support post of the front porch behind it, and also see light reflecting on it and from the ground. So it's a real three-dimensional object. For several years I shared a haunted house with some friends in West Virginia. They had all kinds of strange phenomena there. On any given night you could get orbs and all kinds of other strange phenomena. With a well-known Colorado ghost hunter, we were photographing some orbs in the basement of a house he used to live in, and I wasn't seeing anything, and he was getting lots of stuff, and I was getting a little bit crestfallen. So he said out loud, it was totally dark, and I have my little night shot Sony camera. He said, "Would an orb please show up for Claude's camera?" Within about 2 seconds, an orb popped in right in the middle of my field of view. I have a circle around it in the picture. And the next 20 or 30 frames very leisurely moved toward me and to the right. I have about 30 frames of this orb as it moved toward me. So it was very cooperative, and it convinced me that orbs sometimes show consciousness. Sometimes you see vortices. This is an example of a vortex in the attic of that same haunted house. Of course, in ufology, orbs are often reported. They often show up at the beginning of an abduction, in the bedroom of the abductee. In the Betty Andreas and Luca case, she saw a variety of orbs, including a large orb and several smaller orbs circling it over the pond. Interdimensional phenomena, one more example of this sort of bigger universe that we're being given hints about in these cases. When you have a near-death experience, the most common reported phenomena is a tunnel that opens up, and that becomes your gateway to the other side, the heaven or the being of light. And in that tunnel you'll often encounter relatives, departed loved ones. And this is a painting from Hieronymus Bosch hundreds of years ago, showing the same thing. In UFO cases, some people report tunnels opening up in their walls where sometimes spooky ETs come out. When Bob Monroe used to have his out-of-body experiences, he would often, as he began the experience, he would roll over and a hole would show up in his wall. He would go through it into another dimension. Teleportation, again, these are, I'm going to have to move quickly. We have a variety of examples. My book has a whole chapter on teleportation. And this is another area where you find a lot in UFO cases. Levitation, I have a chapter on levitation in my book as well. Saints are often reported with high credibility by hundreds of witnesses. There have been a number of seemingly credible cases in parapsychology as well. David Douglas Hume was one of the most famous. Sir William Crookes studied him for many years in England. Of course, UFOs levitate is one of their most obvious features. I'm going to move along here. So basically, we're finding that a lot of puzzles are showing up. That time can be twisted. People can travel through time, at least in the remote viewing sense. And then what happens if you change the timeline? And therefore, there's something that permanent that happens when you do change the timeline. So what I'm trying to look for here is a model that is flexible enough and big enough to be able to account for the wide range of phenomena. Here's an example of a Qigong master who you can measure his Qi being projected across the room 30 feet away. And he's also able to affect the hydrogen bonding of water hundreds of miles away from where he's working. Okay, so and we need a theory. And the last chapter of my book, Synchronized Universe, talks about this theory. Basically, it's a non-local model which provides a way for nearby particles to interact with the distant matter of the universe. And if you allow that interaction to have a backwards in time component, which is what the old Feynman-Wheeler model did, so that things can operate backwards in time as well as forwards in time, then the entire system can become coupled together. And that's where the synchronized universe model idea comes from. When the orbits of particles are synchronized, the whole thing breaks down into one system which is synchronized and sees other particles which are synchronized with it as its universe. there could be many, many other systems with a different synchronization. They'll be invisible. They'll only contribute quantum noise. They'll be invisible. So you have parallel universes that very naturally show up in this model. It's as though we live our life on a sheet of paper, which is our sort of 20th century physics space-time. Other sheets of paper in the stack have a slightly different physics because their phases are different. But subtle energies is what allows us to interact between these different systems. So I'll skip over the details of all that, but the model does provide a way, a very natural way, to explain how it is that we can have psychic interaction, remote viewing interaction, affect things at a distance where there's no weakening, because it's a holographic interaction in 4 dimensions, so we're able to couple with other objects that are very, very far away from us, which you need to be able to have something like this to explain the Princeton data. It also involves, this model in the same way explains how teleportation can occur, even all across great distances, because any object really is kind of held in place by its pattern of vibration on the distant matter in the past and future. So that's kind of the secret of the model. So Bob Monroe was right. We're more than our physical bodies. Through prayer, meditation, and visualization, we can create the world we want. And as Victor Hugo said, all the armies of the world are not as powerful as an idea whose time has come. So that's my website. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? Right here.
Has there been any frequencies or a range of frequencies in the spectrum identified with any of the paranormal phenomena?
I think a lot of times, I mean, there are. I don't know. That's probably my real answer is I don't know. If you want to say some kind of mapping between a paranormal phenomenon and a frequency, I don't know. When people are beginning to undergo an out-of-body experience, for example, when their astral body is starting to detach from the physical, they often get a vibration, they often get a buzzing, and abductees report something similar. So there probably is some kind of frequency interaction, but I don't know that there's a specific frequency. It may be that, I don't know beyond that.
Yes. Have you done any work with time travel, such as what's been reported at Damanhur in Italy?
What is going on now, the Russians have developed a model. Back in the 50s it began. It's called torsion. If you look on the web, you can find allusions to this stuff. Nikolai Kozyrev was the creator of it, and in the original book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain by Ostrander and Schroeder, they have a whole chapter about him at that time. That appears to have been the beginnings of a whole technology of how to control time. There are people in Russia today that have little generators that manipulate and create this energy, and they claim that it can slow down or speed up time by a small amount inside a box. So it looks as though there might be a technology emerging for how to affect this stuff. The bigger question is in terms of time loops, if you could really make big time jumps, go back in time, affect the timeline that we're on, shift over to some parallel system. This is one area that we're seeing now in healing. There's a man named Richard Bartlett who's been doing some amazing healing where it looks as though maybe he's jumping timelines. I mean, it's something that our physics is like totally verboten. But if that's what's happening, we may be entering a new paradigm here. So I don't know where this is all going to fall out, but there's some possibilities that are kind of appearing in terms of maybe the timeline is more flexible than we thought.
We have a question in the back.
I'd just like to comment about my distress at seeing how frequently you use the term paranormal in your discussion of these phenomena. Whatever psychic functioning is, it is a normal part of the human capabilities, and we ought not to use language that buys into, that grants half of the debate to hostile critics in advance.
Well, if you have a better word, I'll be happy to consider it. But if you say normal, most people will not understand what you mean. If you say that levitation is normal, most people would not buy into that. So,
we're using consciousness in this meeting.
yeah, we can find other words, but paranormal is a descriptive word, and I would like to see the stigma taken away from it.
Here's another question.
In the same vein, I'm wondering if you could define your use of the word subtle energy, because that seems to be an important component of your model.
Right. Bill Tiller has written several books about subtle energy and is one of the people I would point to in terms of defining or popularizing what it is. It appears that there's a flexibility that occurs. He describes it as a freedom of gauge, where there's a missing degree of freedom that's not in our current physics. And he tries to characterize it by subtle energy. The Russians talk about it in terms of what they call torsion, which is a twisting of space, and it's actually mediated by spin-spin interactions of particles. So this is an effect that you can actually connect back to conventional physics. What makes it different from what current physics would predict is that in our current Einsteinian model of physics, there is no torsion allowed in general relativity. If you put it in the way that the Russians do, then spin-spin interactions start to have a much more powerful effect. So that's the quantitative model that I would appeal to as far as where subtle energy is going to come out. But
One last question here.
Claude, I wonder if you could speculate a bit about the possible common role of vacuum phenomena, such as the reorganization of vacuum fluctuations in so-called paranormal phenomena and UFO phenomena.
Well, vacuum reorganization, or false vacuums, different vacuum states that are not the normal plain vanilla vacuum that I grew up knowing and loving, I think is another way of saying that's what subtle energy is. It's adding a degree of freedom to the physics, so that what we see with the DNA laser experiments, for example, is that we can modify this condition of the vacuum and get anomalous effects that appear to be subtle energy effects. So again, it's suggesting that subtle energy can be looked at as these other modified vacuum states.
Thank you, Claude. We're about to start a break.
You're welcome.